Hey there folks, Kozzi here from Pick One Pack One, and if you're watching this video, congratulations on graduating from Draft 101, how to evaluate cards. This is the continuation in our series. This time we're moving on from evaluating individual cards and we're moving into Draft 201 looking at deck construction as a whole. And in this particular video we're going to be looking at the bread, theory, power curves, and splashing. To start us off with, I want to look at a hamburger. Not because it's nearly lunchtime for me, but because it's a metaphor. Imagine, if you will, that you've learnt just how to analyze different cards, or in a sense, you've learnt how to analyze different ingredients. You can still fall into trouble even with this skill set. It's a bit like if I want to make myself a hamburger and I now know how to assess the finest ingredients from across the world. I know how to get myself a sourdough loaf from my particular artisanal baker, and I go, you know what, I want to make a hamburger. I know how to evaluate great ingredients, so let's just grab a bunch of the best ingredients that I can find in my grocery store. And so we grab ourselves the finest cos lettuce, we get ourselves premium Angus beef. We look over there and we find some French caviar and we go, sweet. When putting together the mince, we realize we have the best vodka we can possibly use, so we whack some of that in. The cheese that we find happens to be amazing crumbly goat feta. And then we also find that we have some haddock, and we also find that we have some starfruit and a bunch of other ingredients that are all phenomenal. You know, we have the world's best wheat bix and the world's best cornflakes, so they have to go on as well, and the world's hottest chili sauce, as well as a whole bunch of finest quality milk from across the lands. And we whack it all on top and we eat the burger and we go, you know what, this is absolutely rubbish. Why did I think that pate, caviar, and beef are great ingredients to go together? And it's a bit like in a draft, finding the best quality cards and constantly going, you know what, that's an amazing 5-drop, I'll keep it. That's an amazing 7-drop, I'll keep it. Hey, that card in the other color, no worries, we'll put it in because it's amazing. And you get down to your actual draft and you know what, it's rubbish. And the reason why is because flavors go together. You know, you have your peaches and cream, your cookies and cream. Apparently cream is great. Likewise bacon. Bacon goes with everything, but certain flavors like caviar can be exceptional in a certain dish. But if they don't have the right friends around them, it's a waste of time. And so to accommodate for this, we're going to be looking at how to build a deck as a whole, deck construction. We're going to be shifting from the question of, is this card good, to start to ask the question of, what does my deck want? And the first answer to this question of what does my deck want is an age-old answer that's been going down through limited Magic players for well over a decade now. And the answer is, we want bread. And no, I don't just mean we want the base. Instead, this is a way of remembering 5 qualities that every limited deck, including your Eternal Draft deck, will want. Our deck wants bombs. Those huge creatures that need to be dealt with, otherwise your opponent loses. Or those units that get you back in the game when you're absolutely down and out. Or those stabilizing cards like your Harsh Rule that just, if you're in real trouble, they can just get you straight back in the game. And you'll notice that with the bread, from left to right, we're talking about most important to least important. And so the B and the R's are the things that you want to be really evaluating quite aggressively, and then moving down this shifting scale. So our deck desperately wants bombs. But a deck with just bombs could also get in trouble if my opponent's bomb is stronger than mine. So we also want removal. We want to be able to deal with those cards that my opponent can put up that are so curly and tricky and problematic. Moving down further, I want, in general, my cards to be evasive. Basically, I want them to be able to ignore my opponent, ideally. That's the gold standard, the absolute ideal. And so having evasion on my cards is a really strong priority for my deck as a whole. Other people will use the E here to describe efficiency. I want to make sure that I can get as much value out of these cards as possible. Failing that, I want to make sure that my cards advance my gameplay as aggressively and as powerfully as possible, so I want ideally some form of aggro or aggression in the cards that I have. Of course, if I have a card that doesn't fit into the B, R, E, and A of bread, then it's probably dregs. The stuff at the bottom of the barrel that I might be forced to put in my deck, but my deck isn't happy for me feeding it. Now, this has been superseded to some respect by the quadrant theory that we looked over much earlier on, which actually gives us an answer as to why something is a bomb, or why something is a great piece of removal. But this gives us an idea that my deck wants more than just good cards. I want an interplay of good cards. And the specific interplay is what we find in archetypes, which we'll be looking at in 2 videos' time. But this is just the brief overview of it. The other element that decks desperately want, that I think is actually what people mistake the most, is to have the correct amount of power, the correct number of sigils to be able to cast your spells. Now, to help us out quickly, when we look at our deck builder, and we look at this concept known as a power curve, what I mean by this is I want to look at this section up here, this little blue box that could so easily get ignored. And what I want to do is that's a graphic representation of the number of 1, 2, 3, and 4 drops I have in my deck, and I want that to look as close as possible to an undulating British countryside. I want a smooth arc to roll up and to roll down, and to be a curve. Why do I want to have a curve with my power allocation? Well, I'm glad you asked my hypothetical conversational partner. I basically want it because on any given turn, let's work on the assumption that I can cast a power on every single turn, then I want to be using the power that's available to me. On turn 1, I have 1 power, I'd like to use it. On turn 2, I have an additional 2 power, and if I've been able to use my power on turn 1 and then the 2 power on turn 2, then I've had the opportunity to use 3 power in total. I'd like to be able to have used a total of 6 power by turn 3. And likewise on turn 4, when I finally drop that 4th sigil, if I've had the opportunity to play a total of 10 power throughout the game, then I'm in a great position. Why? Well, if the game designers are doing their job correctly, and each card is costed appropriately, then having played 10 power on the table by turn 4, I've been able to get a much bigger army and use more of the power available to me than my opponent, who perhaps has just played a 3-drop on turn 3 and missed out on turn 4. I'm eking out the most value out of my cards, not just by having powerful cards, but by making sure I play as many of them on every single turn as possible. And so, in order to do that, I need to build my deck that gives me the highest chances of seeing my 2 drops on turn 2, my 3 drops on turn 3, and my 4 drops on turn 4 as possible. Let's take a look at some of the examples of curves that I've found from decks that I've drafted throughout my history as an Eternal Drafter. And let's ask ourselves just how likely it is that I'll be able to use most of my power in each of these examples. Take, for example, the top one where I have a lot of 1s next to no 2s, a 3, decent number of 3s, 4s, 5s, and then not a lot of 6s and 7s. What would that look like if it was to play out? Well, in my particular match, it played out like this. I was able to play a 1-drop on turn 1, seek power, which allowed me to sort out my power even better. I had no 2-drops, so I wasted 2 power there. And then I was able to curve out with a 3-drop followed by a pretty underpowered 4-drop. And so out of the 10 power that was availed to me by the game, I was able to use 8 of it. And I was in a reasonable position despite missing out on my 2-drop, although in some respects I was quite lucky. If I hadn't have picked up that 3-drop on my draw step and I was only able to play a 1 and then a 4, I would have been in a lot of trouble, primarily because my curve was missing so many 2s. Let's take a look at another example. This is from a really aggressive deck that I played quite recently, where basically the deck was built to have a ginormous number of 1 and 2 drops, a bunch of pieces of equipment to beef them up, and then only a handful of cards that were more expensive. I literally had 1 5, 1 6, 1 3, and a couple of 4s. And the way that this deck curved out was beautiful. I went 1-drop on turn 1, 2-drop on turn 2, so I used all 3 of my power available to me. On turn 3, I didn't draw that 1-2-drop. That was okay because I had another 1-drop and a 2-drop. And I used the Feln Stranger here to represent a 2-drop that I couldn't quite remember. But then on turn 4, I didn't have a 4-drop, but I played 2 more 2s. And it was a gorgeous curve out because my opponent They literally played a 3-drop and a 4-drop, and whilst I wasn't able to get the combat attacks in other than with my Lothrari Ranger, the next turn I was able to draw a combat trick, swing in with everybody, and they were in real trouble. Even though the objective power level of the cards that I was playing was slightly lower than the cards that my opponent was able to play on turn 3 and turn 4, I had saturated my power so much, I built such a wide board state that they weren't able to deal with it as I chump attacked in. I was eking out value by making sure that I could use all of my power on every single turn. This one was much uglier. I didn't have a good number of 2s. I didn't have a good number of 1s. I had a lot of 3s. And I had the same number of 4s and 5s as I had 2s. And I paid for it, man. I didn't have a 1-drop. I didn't have a 2-drop. My opponent played a 2-drop. When they played their 3-drop, I was able to play my first 3. And when they played their 4-drop, I was only able to play another 3. And even though both of my 3s were slightly above curve for the actual power level for being a 3-drop, I still lost the game because I just got overwhelmed by the overall power of them saturating all the power throughout their game. It's interesting to think about this idea of a power curve being a desire for a deck. My deck desires to play its cards on turn because in many respects in Eternal, the biggest limitation we have is this power curve. I can't just pick a 7-drop and play it on turn 1 and go, what do you do? Instead, I need to wait and develop and hope I can play it on turn, and if I'm dead by the point, well, that 7-drop was an entirely dead card in my hand. And so it changes the way that I evaluate these expensive, bomby cards because I know that my deck has certain needs. And so if this is late in the draft and I'm in some kind of Rakano or Stone Scar build where I'm playing with a lot of red cards and I open this up in my 4th pack but I don't have a lot of 2-drops, I might well be tempted. Indeed, I might even make the decision to take an underpowered 2-drop because I need to fill out my curve. And my deck wants 2-drops more than it wants an expensive bomb because it wants to be getting creatures on the table. And so even though objectively Steelbound Dragon is a better card, it is more powerful, it does more, when I start to ask myself the question of what does my deck want, the answer could well be that I want a Pyre Adept late in the game because I'm yearning for cheap creatures. Indeed, even early in the game, if this is in a hypothetical pack 1 for me, and I see that my rare is a Steelbound Dragon and my uncommon is a Rakano Outlaw, knowing that my deck generally wants 2 and 3 drops will probably lead me towards taking the Rakano Outlaw as the pick here. And the reason why is because this Steelbound Dragon actually has some fine print. It's really tiny, like I'd need to blow it up for you to be able to see it underneath the flying and the overwhelm. But what it actually says underneath those 2 words is this will be the only 7-drop I have in my deck. And so if I see another 7-drop or another 6-drop that's also exceptionally good, then I probably can't pick them because I've already picked the Steelbound Dragon, and my curve generally dictates that I don't want too many 7s in my deck at all. Whereas the fine print underneath the Quick Draw and Warcry on my Rakano Outlaw, what it says is this will be one of many 2-drops that you'll proactively want. And so that extra line of text that's really tiny, I promise you can see it if you look at it carefully, that changes the way I evaluate these cards, even though objectively I call both of these cards very bomby units that are probably going to swing a game on their own. And so knowing about this power curve, it totally changes the way I look at these cards. Knowing that my deck is yearning for certain units and spells at certain times totally changes the way I look at this game. Another element that we need to consider when it comes to power is the amount of power cards I put in my deck. And I think it's one of the biggest mistakes I see new players routinely make. They look at Eternal, they might have come from Magic, and they look at the Mulligan system and they go, you know what, sweet, I'm guaranteed 2 power. So I might as well put the bare minimum in. I might as well just put in 15 power that it forces me to do with that 1/3 rule, and then I'm good. I don't need to do anything else because I'll mulligan to at least 2 power cards, and that's it. Massive mistake, guys. Massive mistake. And I want to introduce you to a little mathematical tool that I like to use to try and make the argument as to why. This is a hypergeometric calculator. Yeah, I know, massive scary words, and you can find it on the website StatTrek. Although if you just Google for a hypergeometric calculator, you'll find it right in there. And what this is this is a way of trying to demonstrate a probability question. The idea is if I have a bag of marbles, and inside that bag of marbles, let's say I've got 10 marbles, I've got 3 red marbles. What's the probability of me putting my hand in and pulling out a red marble? Most people can do the maths in their head for that example straight away. It's 3 out of 10. You've got 10 marbles in total, 3 marbles that are red, so 3 chances out of 10. The question is, if I put that aside, so I don't put the red marble back in, or I don't put in the other coloured marble that I might have drawn, and then I draw a second time, well then what's the probability of me having drawn a red marble either out of my first bag of 10, or the second time when it's 9, where I could have either drawn a red marble and I've already fulfilled it and I'm just drawing out another marble for fun, or when I didn't draw a red marble and I draw it out. To apply this to Eternal, I'm kind of asking the same question. If I draw a hand of 7 cards in a deck of 45 that has 15 power sigils in it, and I have 2 power because I had the automatic mulligan and that's what I was given, and I have a 3 drop, well, what's the chance then of me drawing a power card by turn 3 so that I know I can play that card on turn? And this actually helps me work it out. So, I have 45 cards in my deck. I have a hand of 7, so the cards that I have left in my deck are 38. And if I have 15 power in my deck in total, and I was given 2 in my hand, that means I have 13 power left in the deck, randomly shuffled up somewhere in there. I want to ask myself the question, what is the likelihood of me drawing that 3rd power by turn 3? So if I'm on the play, I get to draw 2 cards to answer this question. I'll draw a card at the start of turn 2, and I'll draw a card at the start of turn 3. So my sample size is 2, and I want to know what the likelihood is of me drawing 1 additional power. By putting these elements in and hitting calculate, I can find out that the odds of me drawing either 1 or 2 sigils through my 2 draw steps is just over half, which they're not great odds, folks, considering just how much you feel totally screwed, totally stuffed when you don't draw that 2nd power, especially if you don't have enough 2 drops in your deck, so you're not doing anything, you're just sitting and twiddling thumbs. To know that your chances of drawing out of it is 57% is pretty miserable. If, however, let's say I had 18 sigils in my deck, so instead of having 13 sources of power in my deck that I could possibly draw into, I have 16 instead, because remember, in my opening hand I had 2. Well, then my chances of drawing out of it all of a sudden increase up to 2/3. Still not amazing. You know, we all know that an opening hand with only 2 power, you're in trouble. But my chances of drawing out of it have gone up so much higher because I have a couple more sigils in my deck. We can ask ourselves similar hypothetical questions. Let's say I get myself a pretty standard hand. I have 15 power in my deck, and I draw an opening hand that has 3 sigils in it. And I want to know what the likelihood is of me playing my 5 drop on turn 5. So let's go through it again. I have a population of 38 because I drew 7 cards. And if I have only 15 sigils in my deck and I drew 3 in my hand, then I have 12 left. By turn 5, I want to play my 5 drop, which means I get a draw on turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, and turn 5. So I have a sample size of 4. And I want to know what the likelihood is of me drawing not only 1 sigil to get up to 4, but 2 sigils to get up to 5 on turn. The likelihood of me doing that is just over 1/3 if I only have 15 power in my deck. That's rubbish. I really want to be hitting my stuff on turn 4 and turn 5 on time. Let's go back to the previous example with 18. So instead of only having 12 successes in the population, I have 15. The likelihood goes over half. And so what you'll notice here is the more power I have in my deck, the more odds I have of mitigating getting screwed. And the higher odds I have of being able to do exactly what I wanted to do here, which is to use my power on curve and to use the most powerful card I can each turn to maximize the value I get out of my deck. So let's stop talking in hypotheticals and let's actually start to come to some rules of thumb. For me, having played around on my hypergeometric calculator, I find that in any given deck I want between 17 and 18 sigils or sources of power. If I'm playing an expensive deck with a lot of 5 and 6 drops, I'm probably moving up to 19, maybe even 20. And the only time I'll ever go below 17 is if I have a curve like the one we showed just here, where I have so few 4s and 5s that I really don't mind if I don't hit that 4th power on time. So yeah, guys, please no more of the 15 power in a deck. You want somewhere between 17 to 18, most likely 18. So the final topic we want to talk about with what my deck wants is to look at splashing cards. And what I mean by this is, generally in most decks you end up with 2 colors. Ideally 2 colors that are probably related to each other, so you can start to use the sweet double colored decks, although it's not the end of the world at all. You can draft some very good, we call them enemy colored decks. But you might have come across a very powerful card that's not in your color. And you want to ask yourself, well, what's the chance that I can just throw that in, splash it in, get that extra card to increase the overall quality of my deck? Well, when I look at this, I want to ask myself, first of all, 3 questions about whether I want to include an off-colored card in my deck. I want to look at the power of a card, how much it changes the game. I'm not too interested in just throwing in a random 3-drop. Random 3-drop, it's not going to change the game too much. Instead, generally when I'm looking at splashing, I either want to splash a piece of removal or I want to splash a bomb. Because I'm weakening my power base. I'm weakening the likelihood of me getting the 2 colors I actually want for the sake of adding this card. So I want a certain threshold of value to be met in order for me to include it. So I'm asking myself, how powerful is this card? Next, I want to look at the influence cost, the number of pips of a particular color up the top. You'll notice here that a Thunderstrike Dragon, tell you what, it hits the threshold of being a powerful card. To have an Echo card that gives me 2 5/5 flyers for 6, for the low cost of 1 card in my deck, that's phenomenal. You know, this is one of the better cards in draft. Full stop. Does that mean I splash it into my Stone Scar deck? My Fire Shadow deck? I tell you what, there's a massive cost involved, and the reason why is because in order to cast this, I'm going to need to have 3 pips of blue available to me at the turn that I want to try and cast this card. And so that means the number of blue sigils that I'll need, or the number of blue influence I'll need to gain from elsewhere, is huge. And so in most decks that I build, even if I was to have a Thunderstrike Dragon and it just so turned out that Primal just wasn't open for me, you know, this was my pick 1 pack 1 and then I never saw Primal again, I doubt I'm going to be splashing it, because the likelihood of me getting 3 sources of blue by those turns is next to 0. As a different example, let's take a look at the Crystalline Chalice. If I'm already in blue, then I'm highly likely to be interested in splashing this, because throwing over to just 1 time, I can do that. Let's say, however, I'm in a Combre deck, and so I'm looking at trying to splash double Primal. That's when it gets a lot harder again. And so the same card, but it depends on what side of the colors I am as to whether this is something I'm likely to feel comfortable with splashing, at least through the criteria of influence. The other element I like to look at is the timing of a card. Rakana Outlaw. It's a bomb. It wins games. It's only got 1 influence. By the 2 previous criterion, this should be an easy splashable card, although oftentimes I won't splash this card. Why? Well, if we go back to our hypergeometric calculator and I ask if I have, say, 3 sources of a color in my deck, what's the likelihood of me having it by my second turn? It's going to tell me that the odds are very, very, very low. It basically means that those sources of splash I need to find in my opening hand or within the first draw step or 2. So I get a grand total of 9 cards to look at to see if I can actually cast this card. In general, if I'm going to splash, I want cards that are valuable to me late in the game. And so that's another strike against the Rakano Outlaw. If I'm to cast this guy on turn 6, he's probably not as useful for me. Or is it a she? She's probably not as useful for me as she is on turn 2. Turn 2, Bonafide Bomb. Turn 6, probably going to get blocked by a 3-4. So instead, the kind of card that I'm looking at are more like pieces of removal. If I get lucky and I draw my fixing early, then I'm probably quite happy to use Annihilate early. If, however, I draw this in turn 6 or 7, once I finally found that extra piece of fixing, then I'm probably just as likely to be happy playing Annihilate. And that's one of the reasons why, in general, I'm much more likely to splash for removal than any other type of card. Because they're most likely to be the cards that are both fantastic for me early and also fantastic for me late. So it's the pits when it comes to thinking about splashing. I want to talk about the power of a card, I want to talk about the influence of the card, and I want to talk about the timing of a card in making up my mind on whether I want to include it. Alright, so we've worked out the criterion of if I want to splash a card or not. What are rules of thumb for how I go about paying for it? Because I need to make sure that I have the sources of the right color in order to splash. My rule of thumb, after messing around on a hypergeometric calculator for most of a day, is if I'm splashing a single card, I probably want 3 sources of the correct color in order to splash it. And it's worth noting that there actually are a few ways of getting these sources. The most obvious is I can get the sigils in a deck in order to splash. There are also cards that tutor for sigils, so I can directly find them. Seek Power being the gold standard. And you'll notice that Time is the faction that is very effective at splashing. They have a lot of things, like Amber Acolyte, that can just tutor up sigils from your deck. And then the other really useful card for splashing are your Strangers, that upon summoning, help out your influence straight away. So if I'm looking at one card for a splash, I probably want access to about 3 sources, be it 2 appropriate colored Strangers and a sigil, something like that. If I'm interested in splashing 2 cards, let's say that I'm in a Stone Scar deck and, that I'm in an Elysian deck, okay? So I'm in Time Primal and I want to splash into Shadow for my 2 pieces of removal, then I'm probably looking at having 5 sources as my rule of thumb. And you'll note that this is getting expensive. If I can't do this through my Strangers, and I'm hoping to do this just through my sigils, then I'm massively cutting into the number of different colors I can have. If I'm running 18 sigils and 5 of them need to be in a splash color, then I'm probably never splashing that second card because it's just going to reduce my odds of drawing the cards, the colors that I want for my main deck way too much. Instead, I'm only going to be considering a second card if I have a whole bunch of Strangers or the dual colored seats or whatnot to help me out. 3 or more, that's not a splash anymore, guys. That's a 3-color deck, and that's when you're going to have some kind of a monstrosity of a power base to try and accommodate it, unless you have a phenomenal number of Strangers or Amber Acolytes or something like that. And so, yeah, it's not splashing at that point. And when you're looking at having, people like to call it the Devil's Power Base, 6, 6, and 6, the chances of you getting in real trouble by not drawing the correct color are huge. And it's probably not worth the power of the card that you're bringing in. So sometimes you need to be disciplined. You know, the fun police need to come out and go, you know what? We're only looking at 1 or 2 cards tops. If that's the case, then what are the criterion that help me work out how likely I'm to want to splash in the first place? Yes, we've worked out that there are cards that are powerful enough to splash, and we've looked at the criterion, but what actually makes me as a player go, you know what, this is the time? You know, it's your chance now, you're off the bench, you're into the squad, you get to splash. Well, let's just quickly throw up a Y and X axis here to show a little line graph that will help it out. And well, what I want to consider is, first of all, I want to consider the power of my deck as a whole. How likely do I think it is that this deck's good? And you get a sense of that when you do enough drafts. And if that's the case, I also want to look at my desire to splash. And what you'll find is, if my deck is very, very strong, it's right up the top of that y-axis there, then my desire to splash is quite low. Why? Well, every splash card I put in, it stretches my power base. It stretches my chance of getting the correct influence on turn. And so if the overall quality of my cards is really high, then I just want to play them. I don't want to take risks of not being able to play them because I just happen to draw the wrong colours. And so splashing increases the risk of me getting the wrong colours at the wrong time. If, however, my deck is very weak, it's rubbish. I've just been getting a whole bunch of C-grade cards. You know, I didn't get any bombs. I'm missing removal, and the only removal I got in Pick 1, Pack 1, and it's the wrong colour. Then my desire to splash those powerful cards in a deck that's rubbish anyway is really high, because those bomb cards, those removal, they're the cards that can help me win. And if I don't think my deck has a good chance of winning anyway, well then I need to put in those cards that will help me win. So you'll find you'll have a little line graph that looks like this. The more powerful your deck is, the less likely you want to splash, and the weaker your deck is, the more likely you're willing to take those risks. Because if you think that at the start of a game you're only a 35% chance to win anyway, and you can actually increase those odds but reduce its consistency, you're going to go for those Hail Mary passes. So there you go, folks. What this section is meant to look at is, we've already looked at how to ask the question of, is this card good enough to be put in a deck? But we're actually asking the question of, what does my deck want? Does this fulfill the bread criterion and give my deck the cards that are higher up the scale that it really yearns for? Do these cards fit on a power curve so I can make sure that I can play out my cards correctly and in the right time and saturate my power as much as possible so I can eke out the most value, not only from each card in my deck by making sure that they're as high quality as possible, but from each power that my deck provides? And then, are there cards that are off color that my deck wants because it fulfills that criterion, that isn't having too much of an opportunity cost and undermining the overall power level? Now what you'll notice is, over time, decks will start to look similar. You'll start to get certain themes, and that's the archetypes, which we'll be looking at in 2 videos' time. In the next video, we're going to be talking about how to construct your deck whilst drafting, because that's the other art form. It's not as though we just open up a bunch of cards and you put them together. Instead, you're actually sitting in a seat and with people on either side of you, at least virtually represented. And so in the next video, we're going to be looking at drafting your seat and trying to position yourselves to find yourself picking up the best cards possible in a draft that your deck wants the most. I hope this has been helpful for you. Please feel free to let me know in the comments anything that mightn't be clear or that you want more comment on, or a topic that you feel as though I haven't foreshadowed that I've either done or am getting up to doing. I've been Kozzi, talking for Pick 1 Pack 1. That's been Draft 201 deck construction. Again, just really starting to ask that important question of, what does my deck want? I hope that this helps you guys improve your drafts beyond just drafting good cards, and I look forward to seeing you guys in an Eternal Draft sometime, or in the comments of our videos. Have a good one.